Hello, welcome to a test here for a gesture lecture. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about explaining gesture, and then I've pulled a few kind of beautiful photographs here from the Bodies in Motion website, which we're all working from and will continue to work from throughout the course of the class. The same view here, two different angles, or same pose, I should say, two different angles. And what I was going to do to begin was explain gesture. All right, so over here I have a few skeletons that I've drawn out, not because we're going to be discussing this in detail today, but because gesture is in large part a summary. And so it's difficult, I think, to talk about the beginning when you're really referencing the end. But so we'll use this as a way to make a few points early on. So first thing, let me define gesture, right, to the best of my ability. It's a relatively obscure kind of practice in that it comes in all kinds of different shades and styles, and really has no defined and consistent practice and approach. So what I think is best to do is provide a loose framework for how one can think about the practice of gesture, and then ultimately stylistic concerns or kind of subjective leanings in terms of how you make a certain drawing are still going to be derived from these kind of benchmarks, but can be tailored, right, to however it is that you prefer to draw a gesture. So when I think of gesture, these are the big things for me. And so I'm going to spend some time writing and explaining, and then at the very end, we're going to get to the actual drawing part of this, which in comparison is going to look pretty simple. So the first is always story. And by story, I'm thinking in terms of really, I guess, a narrative step, right? So this would be a communicative quality. It's a drawing that's meant to be seen by an audience, right? So when I'm thinking about story and gesture, one of the most important things is what it is you're trying to say with that figure. Like in many classes, I think that I often, in an analytical drawing, steer away from observation as a strict kind of. I mean, obviously observation's involved, but it isn't completely devoted to photoreal observation. And so the point I always make with students is that no one's ever going to know if the drawing matched the model that you saw. And really, no one's ever going to care. People are just going to be intrigued, excited, or not about your drawing, regardless of whether it matched what was there at the time. So story can be in part described in that way, right? It's I guess maybe even a subjective moment in the drawing where you get to interject into what it is that you're making, how you either feel about the pose or want to tweak the pose to storytell for, let's say, any number of expressions. Right, a great reference that I'll show later in this lecture is from Will Eisner, and he has a page in his one of his books called Micro Dictionary of Gestures, which are all these great postures and positions that sign or function well as silhouette and symbol for these very specific categories of emotion that he lays out. Quite often, gesture is exaggerated, right? So that expression or that pose or that position of the body can read in a clear way. And the Will Eisner silhouette idea that I just referenced is a really clear and concise example of that. Although it doesn't have to be, right? You can also think of gesture as being something that's subtle, right? So you can have exaggeration versus subtlety. So maybe a subtle example would be the storytelling of gesture could be how you recognize your best friend or family member, let's say, from 50 feet away, right? It's stripping out detail, stripping out all kind of finer information. Just how does someone move or hold themselves, position their weight? What is unique to someone in that sense is also their story. So as long as it is kind of involving your interests, your point of view relative to a position or some kind of attitude, there's really no right or wrong answer here. And that's where I start. Second, all right, and these are all going to be more uh, practical concerns, right, or more kind of skeletal or figure and anatomy based concerns. But second to this would be weight and balance. I guess we could also say that these would be more functional or design concerns, right? But for these ones, so let's say these are all going to be our functional concerns. If story is kind of my subjective position towards the figure or towards the drawing, these ones are all more or less functional ideas or designs about the body that I think needs to be maintained in a gesture for it to capture truths or capture realistic aspects about the figure that we're summarizing. So weight and balance is a huge one. And the example I always give here, as far as weight and balance, that I think people make you know, mistakes with gesture, is that I find a lot of people early on when they draw make what I affectionately draw here, Mr. Hanky drawings, right? So referencing the South Park character, right? Or I've drawing teachers say looks like the Michelin Tire Man or Popeye arms. I like Mr. Hanky because he's funny. But the issue is this, right? That I see a lot of students, especially that work and have a background in contour drawing, which isn't bad. It's just the antithesis of what we're doing in many ways. Always make their lines completely symmetrical. And this causes for a real stiff look, presentation. It feels static. It's not that you can't do this, it's just that in gesture, I largely avoid it in preference or for other effects in the drawing, which are going to be primarily based off of rhythm. So if we had to make something that would be the kind of the opposite of what we're after, or define what we're doing against something else, a static kind of contour, outlined, symmetrical drawing would be the antithesis. So what is it then that we actually want? Well, I answer that by kind of looking at what we have. So what is important in a study of weight or balance is to pull out design themes, themes that reoccur in the body. And so what we'll do as we go through this is bridge out here. Right? So imagine this is like a thought bubble that occurs above my head while I'm drawing. So the second category is, what are we drawing? And I leave this purposely open-ended because I draw animals the same way, right? And I use ideas about rhythm and movement for composition. And if you're kind of interested in that, Andrew Loomis has a great book called The Eye of the Painter, where he kind of breaks down compositions in the same way that I would draw a figure, with rhythms and points of stop and controlling the eye, etc. So in this specific lecture here, what are we drawing? 8 parts of the body. So every gesture drawing takes as its goal the summary of these 8 parts. Right? So you're summarizing in a very expedient way these 8 parts while maintaining some kind of subjective position, exaggeration, subtlety, storytelling about that figure. But all of these 8 parts exhibit specific types of designs, specifically, or weight and balance being kind of forefront among them. So what are the 8 parts that we're drawing in gesture? Well, there's some obvious ones, right? So we could say head, rib cage, pelvis. Got 2 legs, except this guy, he's just got 1. That's me being lazy. We have 2 arms, so 6 and 7. And then most important is the spine, right? So let's put it over here. Step 8 would be the spine, or I'm sorry, part 8, not step 8, would be the spine. The most important thing. And really, when I make a gesture drawing, I'm drawing this. So let me explain part of that. Let's get a different color here. Or the importance of thinking the spine. So I think it's easiest here to start out from side view. So when I think of the spine, what I'm trying to delineate in a drawing is the 3 parts. Right? So we would have here the cervical. So I have 7 cervical vertebrae. It'd be the part leading from the head, or from the neck down into the rib cage. So that'd be this. From there I have the thoracic. So thoracic column is a C curve, picking up the rhythm of the cervical, but changing and playing into a different direction. So we could see that there's actually maybe two diagonals here making up this C curve that completely reverses the direction of the cervical. And then after the thoracic, we have the lumbar. And you can see that's going to do the opposite again. And so what I use the spine to think about, or to demonstrate in explaining the gesture drawing, is the radical difference between Mr. Hankey, who here has no spine, and then the effect on the overall look or silhouette of the figure when we consider the spine. Right? So from the head, I have very radical diagonals, right, that are influencing everything in the skeleton for the effects of weight and balance. Right? So the big difference in terms of, let's simplify, or simplifying thoughts about weight, would be Mr. Hankey versus what it is I think we are more so, which are chaotic towers. Right? So because of that spine, what our 8 parts really end up doing is something more like this, which I think is way more interesting than a Mr. Hankey, or kind of a static contour figure, right? That we're really only always in tension. This is going to bring us to how we make the drawing a little bit. But one thing is only upright because of its counterbalance on the next. But what we definitely aren't is, right, static. Right? We would work not at all this way. And the spine sets this up. Right? It's the basic control for how those larger parts of the body are situated. For example, notice that the head is farther out over the rib cage. Right? So I have C7 pushing the neck forward. The head is now balanced out in front of the rib cage as the rib cage develops off the thoracic column. It has a lean that sits counter to the head. The pelvis sits counter to the thoracic spine and rib cage above. Right? So everything is offset, but maintaining upright or upright posture by the way that they all kind of balance and work together. And that continues into other areas of the body too, like for example the legs. We have big femurs that have a large kind of bow or curvature to them that often play into the, or that do play into the tibia in a way that has a lot of curvature. Right? So from the side we could say your legs are a giant S-curve because they're able to absorb impact, create motion. Instead, your legs are not like this, in which case we would probably jump and then our legs would break and we'd fall over, and that would be the end. From, let's say, front or back view, I like to think of the legs as a lightning bolt. Right? So we'd have the femur kind of going in and then back out and then in again. So here making kind of a generic lightning bolt design. Right? Over exaggerated, of course, but it's making the point, or it's exaggerating the point that I want to be able to see all of these forms with a dynamic aspect to their weight. The exaggeration of these design themes is everything when it comes to gesture. And this idea of weight and balance continues. I could look at texture, or all balances of hard, soft, hard, soft. Right? I'm a good example of especially being soft there, hard pelvis, it's soft hip, everything. So a lot of the times an objection that I'll have from students that are practiced and very good at contour is that, well, it's not, how you're drawing gesture isn't expressly realistic, or it doesn't look realistic. And I think it just depends on how you define realism, right? Because for me to pick up on actual themes that are taking place in the body and exploiting those for the purpose of the drawing is very realistic, right? Because I'm describing what is the most important thing or the most realistic engine or mechanism about what it is that I'm seeing. Whereas to me, to copy outside lines without maybe exactly knowing what they are feels very non-realistic. So it's maybe at this point it's just semantics, but it's for me an important point. So that's a little bit of weight and balance. The third thing that I like to always consider or think about when I'm making a drawing is movement. We are figures, right, or drawing figures whose great capacity or beauty is their ability to move. So not only do I want to be able to capture this in the way that I make a drawing, but I have to use, or I think it's important to use a technique that manifests this aspect, that shows it. And so in thinking movement, right, what I'm really trying to get is the opposite of Mr. Henke. Something that's static or something that is without the visual expression of movement. And so this is how I would do that. Now let's add another box here. Let's get to that same color. All right, so I have my gesture, and really what I'm talking about when I made this list, or I continue to make this list, these are all the whys. Right? Why do I make a gesture drawing? Well, now you can see how I order that. Right? The why for me is story, and then after that, it's kind of stepping down in importance. Weight and balance are still an important story element in the figure. I'm just getting a little bit more specific about the design themes that I'm trying to bring to the surface in a gesture study. What? Now you have an idea of what it is exactly you're trying to communicate in that short period of time. You have 8 parts. You know how they relate or what themes are really profound within them. Ideas of asymmetry, imbalance. And now we want to talk about how. How can I maintain all of those or important attributes, but in the actual technical application or making of the drawing. The most important thing for me in the how is still connected to that third element, movement. So like I said, I need to be able to use a drawing approach that showcases movement while also being able to maintain a fluid sensibility in the figure as I draw it. And for me it's simple, right? It's asymmetry. And later I'll show you examples of this, right? Because I didn't invent it. No one recent invented it. You could see it in all Renaissance sketches by Michelangelo. More contemporary, you can see it in The Illusion of Life, the big Disney Bible. I think it's page 68 or 67 that shows that they actually went from this to make Snow White, I think. Right? This is what it looks like for Disney to go bankrupt. This is what it looks like for Disney to own everything. So that's it, right? This is the most important thing when it comes to making a gesture that you'll see me use every single time. Why? Why is this important? If we use lines that are like this, like again, Mr. Henke, we're working with a principle, or we're flirting with a principle in the visual arts called closure, where if I see lines that are indicating for a shape, my brain has a tendency to want to close them off. So what happens? The effect of this is that I create a very like staccato effect or a broken effect in a drawing where the eye sees one form and then stops and then sees the next form and then stops, right, etc., etc. What I want to be able to perform in the drawing in order to maintain movement is complete fluidity. So whenever I make a gesture line, I always make sure that it's hinged, right, in part to the next one. In doing so, if you keep these apexes to the line just slightly off center, you're always going to provoke the eye to move through your path or passageway instead of being trapped or caught by it. So, right, I could do this forever. And then I can even redirect lines or change direction or what have you. But it's giving me that sense of grace or fluidity, movement, but it's also composing. right? So a big part to me of gesture is composition, that I'm telling your eye where to go, how quickly, how slow, is there tempo breaks. This is how I do that. So in the overall, I use no more than 3 lines: a straight, a C curve, and an S curve. And actually, as I make drawings, I never exceed these 3. Right? There's going to be distortions, right? Like that could be an S curve. These are C curves, but I never go beyond a straight, a C, or an S. And when it comes to building volume, I never move past spheres, cylinders, or straights. So all of my drawings are made with 6 elements, right? And they're just recombined or kind of sometimes mixed together. But that is my alphabet. That is my line language. So one last part when it comes to movement would be what exactly do those lines mean, right? So you could see maybe I make some wavy, weird lines, but they don't really relate to anything that you see. And this is a common question that I get is, you're not drawing what's there, you're not drawing a contour. So what do those lines mean and where do you see them? Well, you don't see them, right? I mean, early on, this is a pretty abstract exercise. What's more important at this point is that you're drawing the idea of motion or movement. To be more specific, I think of every one of these lines as a stand-in or representation or abstraction, however you want to say it, for a part. Right? And you know now that we have 8 parts, right? And we walked through all of them. So one line can equal a part. The space in between, this important area of overhang between the lines, is for me the joint. And that's it. Right? That's really all that I'm thinking about as my kind of abstraction of the figure into this stylistic treatment of movement. And that brings us to our last thing. And this is something that I'm going to talk about a little bit more next week when we actually look more at the skeleton, but proportion. It's the least important for now because early on I don't like for students to get caught up in measuring when you have a minute. I'm much more concerned with those ideas of rhythm and motion, right? That you could see here, those asymmetries are just what's very natural to the body and the way that we set it up as that chaotic tower. But also proportion has a big role in story. So if you look at Andrew Loomis again, his page on proportion, he goes through and again, I'll show this next week, but the proportions of an academic to a heroic male. And that's just storytelling, because for the purpose of this story, of course, there's one right proportion or measurement for the human body. But if we're making gesture about storytelling, then it's just the story that matters. We could also use the example of Michelangelo. He obviously knew how to draw figures, but at the end of his life, he was making his figures upwards of 13 heads tall. He was flirting with principles of mannerism, or he was a mannerist at the end of his life. He didn't get it wrong. He chose a different vehicle or template of proportion to express that story. I'm a comic lover, so I like to use the kind of the contrast of pre and post image comics. Pre-image comics, there was a much more conservative, let's say, template of proportions where it was pretty right on, it was more classical. And post-image comics like Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, it's again much more mannerist. There's very long figures, they're expressive, they aren't working towards principles of harmony in the proportions of the figure. To continue, anime has different proportions than Western, fashion has different proportions than something that would be kind of more comic based. It's storytelling at this point. So I want you to keep that in mind. Gesture really is an early blueprint. It solves all of your hard problems early on in a very expedient way so that you can continue to tweak them or build them up, but it's just laying the groundwork. So anything that involves detail or rendering is just not the time for it. Okay, lots of talking, lots of setup. Now I'm going to let you hopefully see how it all comes together here. with these beautiful photographs. So I'm just going to show how all of this now can be put into a process. And in total, I use a very few amount of lines, but I'm going to tell you why and which ones I'm using at every step along the way, not because I want to beat it into your head and make you draw exactly like I do, but because I want you to have complete and full disclosure so that you can change these things and add your own and take away and say, well, I don't like exactly what Michael's doing there. I think it would be cool if this were instead part of the process, right? That's why. So here's how a gesture with all of these things in mind would look. The first thing I always do is the head. And the reason that I do the head is it helps me visualize the total of the figure, so it's a proportional issue. And second, if we think about composition and all of these gesture lines leading out from and to, this is the most important area of psychological interest, the head. So again, like I said, I'm only using these lines, and you're like, oh, what the hell, you used a sphere. Well, that's the only shape that I use in gesture. I just use that. I keep it amongst a kind of a field of lines now because it'll, by contrast, be a focal point. And in addition, what you're going to see me use are wrapping lines. So wrapping lines are also sometimes described as cross contours. So let's imagine we have a cylinder here. I'm not really great at cylinders. I don't need the whole cylinder to show you that there's something here that has space, right? So here think of a cross contour or wrapping line as a rubber band that's wrapping around this. Even if I don't have the whole cylinder there and only put the rubber bands on, you could still get a sense for the space or the three-dimensional direction a form is leaning. Right? So it gives you a 3D shorthand. So a lot of the time as I go through my gesture drawings, I'll put these across the lines just to start to wrap them together, but also hint at that three-dimensional sense of space that I'll later build towards. So for example, a wrapping line I could use in the head here, where I think kind of from brow to ear, to show that it's leaning down. So that's too complicated, don't worry, we'll pick up on it later, but it would be a way to kind of position that 3D for the head. All right, that's done. You don't even have to go that far. So let's make a list. You're going to get annoyed at how list focused I can be. But head, 2, spine. I know that there's 3 parts to the spine, but I'm going to add a fourth part, which would be a stretch, and I'll explain why. So here, how do I find the spine? Well, if we have the neck, right, I'm just thinking that the neck is in silhouette like that. What I want to be able to do is analyze, right? Think inside which way directionally that cervical column would be moving. Right? I know it can't be this because there's no straights or verticals. Right? That's one of the things that we pointed out early on with the weight and the balance. So I know that it has to be, right, if you imagine that side view, turn 3/4, moving that way. So when I make my gesture line, remember I assign 1 curve per part. The cervical column of the spine would look like that. So I can see now angle, and then look at the kind of varied angle of the head. And that's all part of our weight and balance idea. All right, now I'm going to keep going a little bit faster here. Cervical leads into thoracic. I know the thoracic is pushing this way, partly because I know, right, just from understanding the skeleton. Visual clues would be, look how much of an impact the rib cage makes on the contour there. Right, that thoracic spine is pushing all of that rib cage out. Right, that was part of what I hoped to demonstrate with the skeleton here. Right, because of this, all of this bone is being pushed closer to the skin. Okay. The third one is the abdomen. And I'm not drawing the muscle, I'm drawing the idea or the rhythm of it. but it's a great counter rhythm to the thoracic spine. So from thoracic, abdomen, and you could see, right, I'm not nailing every line. I'm searching. So I get 4 or 5 tries. It's a habit, I guess, but it helps me to kind of sneak up on what I think will be the best line. I start light and then I get darker as I get a little bit more confident. And then the very last part is lumbar. So notice here that every time I make a curve, that it's really saying diagonal. Right? So each one is a curve, but it's on a diagonal angle, and it's trying to force that movement to and fro, right, front and back, maintaining that idea, that beauty of the chaotic tower, avoiding the Mr. Hanky design. So that's spine, and then let's say I'm going to put down the amount of lines that I use, just so you have a benchmark. So for the spine there, I try to keep 4. The third area that I move to or try to study or analyze in a gesture is the weight-bearing leg. So where's the weight? Really important to the story of the pose, but I first have to get the pelvis in there. So here, find the weight-bearing leg. Well, that looks like it's on that side. So I'm going to keep or continue my path of gesture curves from the spine into the pelvis. Then from there, femur. So 1 line per part. Why am I drawing a curve? Well, remember I said from the side view that femur has a curve to it, or a bow. So again, no straights. The only time I use straights are like for rigid areas of bone, cast shadows, or areas I want to kind of make a point in the drawing for the viewer to look. So here I have femur. You can add one for the knee if you want. And then I catch and carry that movement into another C or S curve here, which will be what leads me down into the foot. And for the foot, I always just use a triangle. It's a great shape. It suggests stability, and it's also the shape of the foot. And that's it. That's my first, well, it's not it, but it's my first pathway. And I can come back and double check, and I do this a lot in my gestures. If I look at the head, does each line lead me from itself to the next, and then all the way down to the foot? In other words, have I kept a consistent pathway? If the answer is yes, then I can move on. If not, I can change it or make alterations very easily because I've so little invested. Let's try to put a few of these on. Let's put some wrapping lines on. So what I notice here is that the rib cage is leaning back some. So maybe I could start to wrap some lines that way. Or the pelvis is going to be moving 3-dimensionally the opposite way of the rib cage. That's because we're not just 2-dimensional balancing acts, we're also 3-dimensional balancing act. Femur comes forward. So you see I just kind of pepper them in. You could just maybe do 1 per part. It's not for anyone other than me, right? And that's an important thing maybe to consider with gesture, is that this is, like I said, the blueprint. So it should be customized to what you need and how you draw and what you need to kind of get you from point A to point B. But when I finish a drawing or draw things that have a little bit more time invested, people never see this, right? Because it's been layered over. It's like Photoshop layers. I just do it with line weight, right? Making things generally pretty light as I start out, and then gradually increasing the darkness of the line as I move towards the end. So another thing that I like to do at this point that you can play around with is just kind of thinking about where the weight is. And I think I made him probably a little bit stiffer, and so we could correct that, but let's look at my mistake. Right? So sometimes I'll judge the weight by where a plumb line from the nose would fall relative to the foot, and I made it extra stiff. It's just, I think, all of our habits. But now that I have this, I can make adjustments. Right? If I wanted to, I could come back and say, well, the gesture line for the neck is still fine, but maybe the head should have been closer out here. Right? And so I can just go ahead and kind of readjust for that. Or I can move the leg. Right? This is a huge part of what gesture is for me. It's being able to make corrections, make decisions, story tell, without having a lot invested in the drawing. Conversely, I could also say, well, maybe I'd like the leg out here more. It doesn't matter what it looks like in the photograph. What if a pose like this suggests an instability that is particularly expressive of this character's psychological narrative or archetype? Right? So it's open-ended in that sense, or at least I hope that you kind of see it as. All right, so without those complications, let's move to the, hopefully that's not too much of a tangent. 4 would be supporting leg. In this case, there isn't one, so let's just draw the other leg. All that matters is that I continually build pathways, that I don't interrupt that movement or that flow. So here, supporting leg for the femur, and then maybe I'll just make one big S curve for the lower leg and let it flow into the foot. And then I can look at this and say, well, maybe this should be back here. Right? And so even though I'm spending more time doing this now, it does get really habit-based and quick after you've done it a few hundred times. Now let's do some arms. That would be the last thing. So the legs, you saw I did one line per part. We can do the same thing here with the arms. And I usually do shoulder, so one line, or deltoid, humerus, radius ulna, and then I almost always just generalize the radius and the ulna or group it with the hand. And all my wrapping lines there are trying to communicate that this comes forward. Back here, shoulder, humerus, radius ulna, and then flow into the hand and wrapping lines. So that would be how I make a gesture drawing. Now let's do one last one, right? The same pose, just slightly different angle, but faster, right? So this one I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time narrating. We're just gonna run through the steps again. So head, wrapping line, spine, 3 parts, cervical, thoracic, stretch, lumbar, pelvis, which side is the weight on. Maybe even use a wrapping line for that here. Let's show how that contrasts against the rib cage leaning back. Weight bearing leg, femur, lower leg, foot, triangle, leg comes out, so here's the opposite leg. I'm going to use these wrapping lines to show some foreshortening, lower leg, and then into the foot. Another question I get a lot with gesture is how do you do foreshortening or show space? Well, it's really not the time for that. I mean, when I do foreshortening or anything that has to do with space, I need shapes so that I can overlap them, or I need perspectives so I can lean them. Gesture is just lines. So at this point, this is your best bet, right? Just utilizing those wrapping lines to show space. Now arms, here this line. So most important thing is you just never lose rhythm. Thoracic can play into that deltoid line. Here's the humerus, radius ulna, hand, and then same thing on this side. Now even though I kind of was cursory and dismissive of the idea of proportions, there is something that I like to do with my gestures just to make sure they are proportionate. I just imagine, and this would be an 8-head figure, so slightly off what would be academic, or off of what would be academic, but I imagine this is half. Because in gesture drawing, I just want to make big global proportional measurements, right? I don't want to get bogged down in fine kind of precise measurements. You have to, just not now. So when I'm making my gestures, when I get from head to pelvis, I usually just try to match that from pelvis to foot or leg. Sometimes if that's, like here I probably made it too long, could just bring it up. That's really it though, right? I don't want to put a lot more into it other than big halves, or you could also double check the top as 4 heads. But in a minute pose, you'd be lucky to really consider this. So that is the introduction, right? We're going to do a lot more studies to help drive this point home, but as long as you can get comfortable thinking why, what, and how, and then practice this process 1 through 5, I think pretty quickly and pretty easily you'll be on your way to making gesture drawings.